Welcome to another episode of Work in Progress, brought to you by the Connecticut Shoreline Green Party here in the studios of Madison Cable Access. And our episode today is featuring Michael Abendondolo, who is the co-chair of the newly formed Madison Green Town Committee. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you, Owen. I appreciate being here on behalf of the Greens and on behalf of myself. I'm here as a Madison resident, also as a member of the Green Party, the chair of the Green Town Committee, and I'm also starting a SSDP, Students for Sensible Drug Policy, chapter at Southern Connecticut University in the next few years, too.
Great. So that is what we're going to be talking about today is, sensible drug reform policy, what's been happening in the state of Connecticut. It's exciting that our nationwide there has been a lot of energy and movement into reforming our laws, making them more socially just and in line with contemporary science and health policy. So just to start out, what has the legalization movement in Connecticut been like?
So it's been very exciting. So just to give a little context to viewers, Connecticut has marijuana is decriminalized in Connecticut, and we have a medical marijuana program. So decriminalization means that if you're, say, pulled over for speeding and the police find the threshold is up to a half ounce. Up to a half ounce, you get a citation, so like a speeding ticket, more or less. And above that half ounce, it would be more severe. So you'd be looking at larger fines, possible jail time, depending on amounts, depending on context. So that's kind of the legal side of things where we're at now, where it's tolerated, but it's not taxed. So the state doesn't benefit
So
from
we're
it.
not the last state to get on board with some drug reform, but we're still not nearly as far ahead as other states nearby us, like Massachusetts.
Yeah, so and in the past few years, there's been a couple of legislative initiatives to legalize marijuana at the state level in Connecticut. And this past year, it's been very exciting because there's been a lot of bills thrown out there in the legislature. The most prominent one being from Senator Martin Looney. He had a bill to legalize cannabis for those above 21 and older, similar regulation to alcohol. And unfortunately, it didn't pass committee, but there's a lot of people on the ground, a lot of good activism, and a lot of state senators from both parties, as well as third parties too, that support legalization. And in the next coming years, there's going to be a good movement of people putting pressure on lawmakers, and lawmakers that are empathetic and understanding of the issues at stake. Because currently, as I'm sure we all know, living in Connecticut, the state is in some budgetary issues, and it's projected by the Office of Fiscal Analysis that legalized marijuana would bring anywhere between $45 to $104 million a year in revenue. And this is state tax, so this could be used for schools, for infrastructure, for addiction even, drug education. Here is an area where the state can make money at a time when the state is losing money from people leaving the state and tax issues. So in terms of the financial side, it definitely makes sense.
And it seems like that's a bipartisan issue, right? I've heard that some Republican as well as Democratic legislators are considering that aspect very strongly. Well, not only, will it make us money, but it'll also kind of safely regulate and within a legal threshold kind of control who has access to it. So, you hear arguments against legalization like, oh, it's a gateway drug, or young kids will have access to it, and it'll open the door, and it's physically addicting. I've been shocked at state senators, local state senators, and even health policy advocates from Yale who are using some of those old, outdated arguments. And yet, it seems like there's a lot of positives. Can you talk about some of the positives?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think with regards to concerns about teens or children accessing drugs, I want to be very clear and very explicit in that supporting legalization does not support a free-for-all for everyone to, just get loaded or get stoned, whatever it is. Legalization should be and is synonymous with regulation, because currently in the black market, it's unregulated. So anyone can buy it. You don't know what you're buying. There's no testing. There's no safety. There's no regulation, no protocol whatsoever in terms of like a legal or ethical standpoint. So regulating it would actually make it safer. So it would address those concerns, but in a much more productive way. So you could have age limits. You could say, hey, you have to be at least 21 to buy cannabis. You can only buy this amount per day or per week, per shop. There's different ways you can implement it. And actually, if you look at medical marijuana in Connecticut, as well as recreational marijuana out west in places like Colorado, they have percentages of CBD and THC, the psychoactive ingredient in cannabis. They actually have it listed, so you know how potent the product is, and you can decide as a consumer if that's what you would like to do. Just as when you go in a liquor shop, you can see, you know, do I want the 40 proof vodka or do I want the 50 proof vodka? You know, it's not a gamble. You're not gambling with your health.
And you know it's not going to have some illegal additive added to it because it is regulated. And
exactly.
I know people who have medical marijuana, and yeah, it's like a prescription. I mean, I don't know that that would necessarily be exactly the same for regulated recreational use, but it's a good show of the fact, an example of the fact that it would be controlled to the point where you would know what you're getting in this drug rather than having it come off the streets and potentially be quite dangerous.
Yes, it would be. Yes, it would be very tightly regulated in that sense, and a lot of protocol in terms of grow facilities and in terms of quality control too. Like a very all-encompassing regulatory framework that is starting to be developed in Colorado. But keep in mind too that this is like it's very new. So this is all kind of on the forefront, and this is a chance for Connecticut to be really a leader as other states in New England start to legalize. This is a chance for Connecticut to hop on board and to join the momentum, and frankly, the inevitable fact that marijuana will soon be legalized in most places in the U.S.
Right.
A matter of years or decade even.
Yeah, so talk a little bit about the nationwide attitude and where we stand in that, because, you know, it is, I like to think of Connecticut as a leader. We have been a leader in progressive policy in the past, and it seems like we're going to be last to the dance because Massachusetts and Maine are leading the way on progressive legislation like marijuana legalization. And a subject for another topic is Maine's passing the ranked choice voting, you know, so by referendum. It's great to see that. But where does Connecticut stand in terms of comparison to nationwide attitudes and legalization movement?
Yeah, so nationwide, there's been a lot of great momentum within the past decade, really amplified within the last 5 years. So more than 25 states allow medical marijuana, including Connecticut, and 8 states currently have legalized recreational uses. So Colorado, Washington, Oregon, California, Nevada, Maine, Massachusetts, Alaska, Nevada, as well as DC have regulated legalization. But at the same time, though, federally, it's still a Schedule I drug, which is an issue because the states have legalized it, but marijuana businesses can't get loans, they can't use banks, because federally that would be considered money laundering, and it also is a hinder to research. So I think it's going to be done on a statewide issue, but the DEA, the drug scheduling really needs to change, because if you look through the drug schedule, it's very arbitrary and it's not really based on science. So a quick example would be Schedule I drugs are the highest potential for abuse, no medical value, very dangerous, very illegal. Things like LSD, heroin, marijuana. Interesting enough, cocaine is a Schedule II drug, meaning according to the DEA, cocaine is less addictive, less deadly, and can be prescribed, whereas marijuana can't. So that's just a little bit of the hypocrisy on the federal level.
Some of our laws are so outdated. I also think of the 1994 crime bill under Bill Clinton, where we have like this epidemic of mass incarceration. And much of that is for small level marijuana offenses. I mean, can you talk a little bit about that and kind of the harm, the societal harm of you know, having these outdated laws on the books?
Definitely, yeah. So, you know, because of things like the 1994 crime bill, as well as really the ongoing war of drugs, starting really with Nixon, amplified by Reagan, it's led to an entire generation and entire communities either locked up or under state supervision, mostly for nonviolent drug offenses. You know, things like possession, you know, having a couple joints in your pocket or whatever it is. And people have their livelihoods destroyed, their families destroyed, their communities destroyed. And unfortunately, on a federal level, it looks like President Trump and Attorney General Jeff Sessions are looking to roll back some of the progress Obama started. So it seems that, predictably so, sadly, that the Trump administration wants to bring back the war on drugs and escalate it even more.
It's astounding, the length of sentences that you find for people who have been convicted of marijuana possession or distribution. And you know, you look at the totality of marijuana impact societally versus a legal drug like alcohol, and the amount of highway deaths, the amount of death by cirrhosis of the liver, the amount of domestic violence and other violence that is a result of alcohol-fueled, you know, behavior. And it's just, how did we get here? I mean, how is that a thing, so to say?
And you know, it's funny because at the same time with alcohol, the numbers of people dying from DUIs have been declining. You know, the number of teens smoking cigarettes have been declining. So these are legal, regulated drugs, yet not everyone is smoking a pack of cigarettes a day. Not everyone is going to the bar every single day. So I hear a lot of arguments that if you allow legalization, then it's going to be a free-for-all, which I think if you look at the example of pharmaceutical drugs, cigarettes, and alcohol, you can see that it's not a free-for-all and that it's tightly regulated, and that cannabis regulation can be very similar. In terms of just, you know, educating the youth and just protecting society, really. Because ultimately, drugs should be more of drugs are a public health issue rather than a criminal justice system. And I think that's really where the U.S. has kind of gotten things a little backwards, and treated people as criminals and not as, you know, addicts or people that need help and some guidance and assistance along the way.
Right. It would seem like, you know, this is one of the reasons I think you and I are active in the Green Party, is that we need a party that represents people and the interests of people rather than large corporations that are funding, you know, Democrats and Republicans, because I think we need a massive cultural change here. We need to stop pumping money into the prison industrial complex and into law enforcement and start moving that money into public health, and treat drug addiction and really put some attention on opioid abuse as well, which comes from the pharmaceutical industry that is legally a lot of those drugs, and start looking at how can we invest in the interests of people and not in like the alcohol lobby's interests or even the pharmaceutical lobby's interests, but in people's interests.
And I think we're starting to see a little bit about that. Moving away from marijuana just for a minute here, in terms of opiates, there's been not just in Connecticut, but a nationwide, it seems that there's been a shift in how people perceive and how people talk about people that are addicted now. So for instance, during the, you know, so-called crack epidemic of the 80s, when crack really first got introduced to the scene, there was a lot of rhetoric about, you know, these people are ultra violent, we need to lock these people up, they're animals, they're barbarians, just lock away, throw them the key. And that's what we did.
Yeah, predators.
Super predators, exactly. Entire communities were ravaged, mostly minority communities. Right. And now we're seeing that, okay, elephant out of the bag, that white people are getting addicted to heroin now suddenly. Now people are starting to be more compassionate. You even have people like Chris Christie being empathetic and rational somehow. And I think you are starting to see a little bit of shift in how people treat addiction, especially with the ongoing opioid epidemic. But at the same time, though, there was a bill introduced this past year in the Connecticut legislature that would make first-time possession of heroin a felony, which I mean, the effects of that would be disastrous, because if you're going after possession, you're not going after dealers, you're going after addicts, people that it's not a matter of willpower. You know, if they don't have heroin, they're going to be sick and
Right.
they're going to be detoxing. So they'll do whatever they can to get it. And simply giving them a felony, that's not going to stop them, because they can get the heroin in jail as well.
Right. Right.
So I think there needs to be more of a harm reduction approach, and really acknowledging that drug use is a part of human experience, whether you like it or not, and that the emphasis should be on minimizing the damage and having safer alternatives. So for instance...
So yeah, tell us a little bit about the philosophy behind harm reduction. What does that mean, and how is that played out?
So in terms of drug policy, I'd say there's like two kind of competing ideologies. One is a prohibitionist kind of temperance movement mindset, which the US and most countries have followed, which seems to be the goal of eradicating drugs and the whole idea of a drug-free society, which frankly, in my opinion, has never really existed in human history, and it's a fantasy. So that's one side of things. And that side, you have, you know, the war on drugs, you have mandatory minimums, you have really draconian possession laws. And then on the other side of things, you have this relatively new movement called harm reduction within the last few decades. And harm reduction is accepting that there will always be people on drugs, and that we should make their lives safer and treat them as humans and try to be as humane and respectful as possible to their needs and wants. So there's, for instance, a really great organization out of Hartford called the Greater Hartford Harm Reduction Council, GHHRC. You can find them on Facebook or online, and they do a lot of great work in the Hartford area and throughout Connecticut, really. They
Greater
do things.
Hartford Harm Reduction Council?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, that's the name of them. They do really great work with harm reduction. They focus mostly on the opioid epidemic, and their work is doing things like naloxone training, which it's otherwise known as Narcan, and this is a drug that you could give someone that's having an opioid overdose, and it will literally bring them back to life. So they provide training to groups.
It's a rescue drug. That
Yeah, it's a rescue
EMTs,
drug.
do police have it too?
Yeah, police are starting to carry it. I believe schools are starting to carry it. I believe anyone can get a prescription for it. You don't have to be an addict, and you just give it to someone through the nose, and they'll come back to life. They'll be withdrawing, they'll be miserable, but it'll save their life. So they provide training for that. They also do syringe exchange, where they exchange dirty needles for clean needles to help reduce the spread of infectious
HIV,
diseases like HIV,
hepatitis,
AIDS, hepatitis, tuberculosis.
Sure. Bringing it back to the here and now, here in Connecticut and locally, I mean, why do you think we haven't gotten a bill passed this year? There's been a bunch of them that have been on the table, I think, and Martin Looney has been big behind it. There's been a lot of co-sponsors. So why do you think it hasn't? And is there still a chance that we might pass? And I know here in Madison, Senator Kennedy is very much against it. I understand, and I saw him speak at the forum. It's sad to see that. But I know that Noreen Cocaruta is on the fence. I understand, and it would be great to see her take leadership in voting in favor of it. Yeah.
So it didn't pass committee. There's a slight chance it could pass by the time they have to go on recess, the state senators. Very unlikely. The scenario in which it would pass would be in which, so like as we know, the state has, you know, a budget deficit and a way to meet that deficit, because it's projected that it would bring anywhere from $45 to $100 million.
So we're talking at least like over $50 million probably.
And that's also according
in
to
revenue. Wow.
the Office of Fiscal Analysis. So
Wow.
like,
It's not a drop in the bucket.
Right.
Among the other many benefits of sensible drug reform.
So that's one possible way it could pass this year. The odds of that happening aren't too likely, frankly, which is okay, because the silver lining is that there's a lot of good activism and a lot of bipartisan support, frankly, in support of legalization. So I think in the next year, there will be a lot of momentum and more of an urge, more of an incentive for people to support it and push it through the legislative process. And in terms of why it didn't pass, I think sadly too many people have these outdated stereotypes and tropes of marijuana users or drug users in general as being stupid, as just being the downfall of civilization, and that, as soon as you start smoking marijuana, next thing you know, you're going to be injecting heroin, which is just ludicrous on itself, on its own merit.
Well, as a parent of young teenagers, I wouldn't want them having access to marijuana, and I talk to them about it, but I recognize that they're not going to get access to it just through this sensible drug reform.
Yeah, and that's why, I bring up the fact that if you're a high schooler now, I would argue that it's probably easier to obtain marijuana than it is to obtain alcohol. Because in order to obtain alcohol, you have to find someone who's over 21 that's willing to risk possible jail time buying for a minor, very unlikely, or you could fake an ID, which that's, fraud, so very unlikely. If you go into a store and don't show ID and you're clearly underage, they're not going to sell it to you. If you go to a dealer, age doesn't matter. Who you are doesn't matter. Where you are, they'll sell it in a school, they'll sell it wherever. They're just trying to make a profit, first and foremost. At least in a regulated market, there's still the emphasis on profit, but safety is a much more of a focal concern.
So I'm thinking of information I've seen that from the Journal of American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, a study in June 2016 that shows that teen marijuana use rates have not gone up following policy reform. So, I mean, if you look at evidence-based rationale for legislation, there is a lot of such evidence, I think, that supports legalization and does, refutes kind of the reefer madness arguments.
Yeah, and I think a key kind of component of the reefer madness mindset is this idea of marijuana being a stepping stone. We've all heard, the gateway theory, right? And the problem with that is that, people that are addicted to hard drugs, people that are, addicted to cocaine, people that are addicted to heroin, a lot of them probably did smoke marijuana at some point, but that does not mean that literally every single person that smokes marijuana will go on to be a heroin addict, cocaine addict, fill in the blank. And that is a chance of that happening, but it's not, I guess what I'm trying to say, it's exaggerated. It's not a direct correlation whatsoever. And I mean, a lot of people that do heroin also drink, and I don't think we should ban drinking or cigarettes anytime soon.
Right.
So I think
they drink water too.
Right. Yeah. So I think it's people need to be critically thinking about these things and very skeptical of jumping to conclusions and false equivalencies.
But at the same time, I mean, how we invest our money as a society, as a state, is, we're investing more and more in criminalization. It's hurting families and it's hurting individuals who will suffer still with the effects of having a past conviction on their record for the rest of their lives. So, just it seems like there's a lot of societal damage that we're not highlighting, coming from the fact that we still have these outdated laws.
And then also, so on an individual level, it causes a lot of harm. And then even on a more macro state level, it causes harm. Because if you look at regionally, Massachusetts just legalized. Rhode Island is likely to legalize. So that means that our neighboring states will have legalized. So people will drive through Connecticut, not paying any tolls, buy their legalized tax pot in Rhode Island and Massachusetts, drive across the border back to New York, and Connecticut doesn't get any revenue.
We don't get dime.
We don't get any
no
dime.
wonder we're broke.
Massachusetts makes some money off the pot. Rhode Island makes money off the pot.
And the New Yorkers are all getting high.
Yeah, and they get all the and they make the money off the tolls. So what's left with Connecticut? So I think in terms of like a fiscal side of things and in terms of a state side of things, it really makes sense for legalization to be more of a urge to push through it either this session or definitely next session, especially in light of the state's financial quagmire.
Yeah, you've convinced me. I mean, the financial benefits, right? The regulatory control benefits, And the fact that we will actually have a lot of benefits to reducing illegal usage and unregulated usage, and having a quality control for what should not be a criminal issue, but if there are any issues around usage, should be a public health issue.
And I don't want people to take my word for it. You know, I want people to look at, there's a recent Gallup poll this past fall that showed a record number, 60% of Americans support legalization, 60%. And that's the highest support in over 47 years that they've been asking this question.
Yeah. Like there's a lot of other things too, like single-payer health care. A great majority of Americans support that. We haven't gotten it yet. A great majority of Americans don't want Social Security to be, cut, and yet our Republican and Democratic legislators are not on board with the rest of the American people. So it's an area where we as Greens, I think, show leadership, and why we need more people to join with us in this.
Absolutely, and a party that really fights for what the American people want, and really trying to have our laws and our politics kind of catch up to where our society's at, because there is that disconnect. And frankly, the two parties really represent that disconnect, and that seems to be the status quo we're in, where they're fine with passing legislation that the majority of citizens don't approve of. So that's why I think, the Green Party and organizations offering an alternative and really trying to step out of the status quo of, drug war and mass incarceration and just everything that comes from just a inhumane drug policy, because it's not just about drug users. It's about criminal justice. It's about income. It's about livelihoods. It's about people's freedom. So it's a very encompassing issue. It also deals with asset forfeiture. So under current drug laws, if you're arrested for drugs, the police are legally able to seize any property that they determine was used in facilitation with drug dealing. And they don't have to prove it. So they can confiscate your house, they can confiscate your vehicle, and they can just say, well, you had a couple ounces of marijuana, so the money in your pocket, it must have been from the marijuana. They don't have to prove it in a court of law. So in terms of criminal justice reform, in terms of policing reform, there's a lot of avenues that drug policy touches on. So I think it's a very important issue.
Any final words about the future, or what we need to think about here in Connecticut?
I'm very hopeful. I'm hopeful for avenues like this to discuss this publicly. I'm also very hopeful for organizations like SSDP, Students for Sensible Drug Policy. Once again, Greater Hartford Harm Reduction Council, they're doing some fantastic work. And then I'm really hopeful for senators like Senator Martin Looney. Hopefully Noreen Kokaruda, I heard she's has considered it. So I'm really hopeful for future sessions and the next couple years. The momentum, I think it's only going to build, and frankly, I think it's only inevitable that there will be legalized marijuana in Connecticut. I think it's only a matter of when, not if.
Yeah. Well, thanks. Our guest today has been Michael Abandondolo. He is a student at Southern Connecticut State University, an organizer for Students for Sensible Drug Policy, and the co-chair of the Madison Green Town Committee. This is another production of Work in Progress, brought to you by the Shoreline Greens.